Hello, my name is Karmen and this is my presentation for Advanced Exercise Physiology at Northern Michigan University. And today I'm going to be talking about training periodization for high school Nordic ski racing. So a quick overview on topics to be discussed. First, we're going to talk about high school skiing in a background, periodization, and what it is, why we care, training types, aerobic, anaerobic, and strength. Yearly periodization, we're going to talk about training blocks and tapering, finish off with training plan breakdown and specific plans. So to start, it's important to know kind of how high school skiing is organized. Typically, your public school system is going to be a couple months long, like 3 months long, and then have a state championship event at the end. So this level of competition is very broad. You have athletes who want to try it out for the first time, and you have athletes who are trying to compete at the national level and are very serious. So you kind of get a hodgepodge of competition at public high school races. In addition to that, the athletes who are looking for a higher level of competition typically partake in what are called junior national qualifying races, and those are held on the weekend, and they are in addition to races associated with one of the athletes' respective schools. So these races are geared toward qualifying for a national event that is a week-long series called Junior Nationals, and that's held at the end of the season, and it's basically the top junior Nordic athletes in the country getting together and racing. So with that, we'll go on to why we care about Nordic skiing and periodization. So obviously the athletes themselves are going to care. They're going to need to know a general sense of why they're doing the training that they're doing and why they're doing the workouts that they're doing. Coaches should definitely care about a periodized plan, because without one, they really have no foundation for the training that they're prescribing their athletes. And without any type of foundation or plan, they're pretty much punching in the dark as they try to get these athletes to attain their goals. Now, I recognize that many of you watching this are not in high school, let alone skiers. However, I think that this information warrants warrants attention from the general public, because it demonstrates just how the body is capable of achieving physical development through good planning and time. So your training plan is going to be made up of aerobic training, strength training, intensity training, or anaerobic training, overspeeds, and race. So overspeeds are usually just assisted speeds, and it's a way for the athlete to get a sense of what it feels like to have their body moving at really high velocities, and those are typically thrown into an anaerobic workout. So we'll go into each of these in more detail, starting with aerobic training. Aerobic training is going to make up most of your training plan for a high school Nordic athlete. It's going to be about 70% of the yearly training volume. Examples are over distance days, or ODs, and that's where the high schooler is going to be going out once a week for really long 3-hour runs or roller skis or regular snow skiing at consistently very low heart rates. The majority of aerobic volume is done in the summer, where they will be training anywhere from 8 to 22 hours a week aerobically. And then in about October, aerobic volume is going to start to go down as intensity training starts to increase. And that will become progressively more pronounced throughout the year as more races start getting involved. So strength training, In the spring and early summer, which marks the beginning of the athlete's training year, typically an athlete will ease into a max strength routine where weight will be determined based off of a 1 rep max test. However, a lot of times for high schoolers, especially those just starting out, they're not going to be doing a 1 rep max test. They're going to be doing a lot of body weight stuff, and that's just so that they have a foundation of strength that can sustain their own body weight, and it also helps to develop proper weight lifting techniques. So if you start out without doing a lot of weight. Later in the summer, power and velocity strength will be introduced. The athlete is expected to then decrease their total volume and focus more on speed of movement and greater power production. When the athlete gets closer to the racing season, they should be doing strength mainly to maintain all of the gains that they made throughout the summer. So with that, here is a video that will show kind of what you would find in a strength routine for a Nordic athlete, and it's done by a U.S. ski team member, but it's a good example of specific strength for Nordics.
Obviously, we do spend a lot of time out there skiing, but the weight room has been a great place for us to see big gains. It's a chance to develop that power that you need to really accelerate out on the trail. In the weight room, I like to do pull-ups with 45 pounds strapped around my waist. It's a pretty intense exercise. You can only hammer out 1 or 2 reps, and when you're done, you're done. But it's kind of like, you put that weight on now to get strong, and then when you get on the trail and that weight is off, then you can really fly. In cross-country skiing, the core is incredibly important. The more we can really transfer the power into the snow, the core kind of keeps everything solid. So we do some pretty dynamic core exercises where we're hanging off the pull-up bar, kind of mimicking a windshield wiper motion back and forth, and it really throws your body into different positions so that you have to not only develop the strength, but the coordination as well. And we've seen huge gains in the transfer to the ski movements from those gym exercises. Balance and coordination is a huge part of what we do. So we've actually been spending a lot of time lately focusing on balance, especially on unstable surfaces. So I was standing on a Bosu ball, which was nice and unstable, while the physical therapist threw the medicine ball at me, and I had to react to what was coming with me. Then we were doing some power cleans, a nice explosive Olympic lift. Power cleans are a great exercise for us because they not only develop the strength in the legs and the back, but it's a coordination thing too, and it's all about being quick and powerful, which is what we need on our skis. In cross-country skiing, a typical week for us is kind of a funny thing because you write down in your training log the amount of training you do, and it maybe equates to 20 or 25 hours a week. But in reality, the amount of time you're spending committed to your sport far exceeds what you actually write in your training log.
So the next component to the yearly training plan is anaerobic or intensity training, and this consists of about 15% of the yearly training plan, and it includes your time trials, races, and other sports. You'll see that a lot of high schoolers who haven't completely specialized in skiing yet, they could be getting this 15% of anaerobic training from junior varsity biking, cross-country running, or track and field. Some like to swim or play soccer, so you're gonna have to see what kind of athlete you have and where a lot of this anaerobic training is gonna be coming from. One thing that's important for high schoolers is to make these hard efforts enjoyable so that they develop a positive association with racing and competing. So implementing mock relays might be a good thing for a coach to think about during practices. sometimes instead of doing an actual time trial, it might be more fun to make up a sprint course and have elimination rounds. Just ways to keep things fun for the athletes, because a lot of times this training, it can be overwhelming. So recovery, although there isn't a specific percentage of time spent in recovery set out for the yearly training plan, it should be emphasized. We'll look at this a little bit more when we discuss supercompensation, but recovery needs to be a part of a high schooler's daily training plan, and also structured into the mesocycle after the competition season is over and before the new training season starts. So this is a picture of another US ski team member who made his own ice bath, and it's just a, kind of a funny way that demonstrates the different techniques to recovery, and that sometimes it has to be a conscious effort to recovery, and a lot of times you're going to have to explain this to your high school athlete, that just playing video games might not be recovery enough, or going to the hockey games at night is not recovery enough, and you can be just as serious with your recovery as you are with your intense training sessions. So periodization, after all of this, we still have not necessarily defined periodization. So periodization is essentially a framework for organizing the training process of an athlete. Periodization coordinates strength, speed, endurance in an efficient manner to promote positive development by manipulating training loads, and those training loads will encompass your intensity, your volume, your duration, and your frequency. So periodization will promote willpower, self-confidence, the ability to withstand higher training and competition demands while allowing peak performance at competition, and also avoiding over and under training. Because without a periodized plan, you really don't have a plan. In an organized training design, you will find short and long-term planning that utilizes alternating blocks of training loads and recovery. As you can see from the slide, there are a lot of different ways for dividing and defining sections of the training plan, and we'll go into more details on each of these a little later, but first let's talk about training cycles. So when you're developing your plan, a coach should communicate with the athlete and touch base on what the athlete's goals are, and then segment a training plan using micro, meso, and macro cycles accordingly. So the high schooler who wants to compete beyond high school in college or on an Olympic development team, they're gonna want to incorporate all 4 years of high school into some sort of plan. However, within those 4 years, they're gonna plan their macro cycle, and that's going to be one of those 4 years. So within that 1 year, you're going to have your mesocycles, and a mesocycle is synonymous with a training block, and that will be about 3 to 4 weeks of training. So if you look at the last slide and you look at the graph, that bar graph in the top corner there, each of those bars represents a training block or a mesocycle. So for example, bar 1 right here, that's going to be 3 to 4 weeks of training, and as you can see, that is of pretty low volume here, and that's simply because it's the first training block of this particular season or training year. And you can see as the volume gets progressively bigger until you get to your largest block of volume, which is number 4 here. So that would be like the summer when you're getting in all of that aerobic training that we talked about earlier. And then you can see the block cycle. And then over at about block 10, training block 10 through 12, that's pretty low volume, and that's simply because this time, this is really going to be your season. You're going to be racing a lot here, so you don't need to have a whole lot of volume. You just need to be ready for your race days. And then over here at 13, that is that's recovery, the recovery mesocycle that I had alluded to earlier. And basically, when your racing season is done, before the next training year has started, is when you're going to be in that block of training. So going back to the cycles, skiers who are only concerned with one race or one season, like state championships on their senior year, having a training plan that consists of only a few mesocycles might be enough. A few training blocks might be adequate enough for those athletes, especially because they typically are looking at other sports during the year and they are not that ski specific. So you would think about giving them a training plan that is really only thought out for a couple months. Lastly, you have the microcycles, and this part of the training plan tells the athlete what they are going to be doing on each particular day of the week. So now we're going to talk about super compensation. And so with each of those training blocks we talked about, you're going to have let's say there's 4 weeks to one training block. Now, each of those weeks are going to be of their own differing volume and intensity. So out of those 4 weeks, you could have 1 week that is of high volume, 1 week that is of high intensity, and then 1 week that is much lower in both volume and intensity. And that's going to be like your recovery week. And then you're going to have a week where you're back getting in lots of volume again. So the reason why we cycle like that has to do with supercompensation. And the idea is that by applying a series of stimuli, you will displace homeostasis and follow that with recovery. So that process will induce adaptation. So basically, if you start at a level of homeostasis, then you add a training stimulus, you're adding a stress to your system. And then after recovery, the athlete comes back stronger, and when that stimulus was first applied. The trick is to hit the athlete with another stimulus at the right time. So if you add a secondary stress too early, the athlete will not benefit from the first stimulus as much as they potentially could have. So if you repeat that process over time, where you keep adding another stimulus too early, that is when you're going to start running into your overtraining and injuries. So on the flip side, however, if you wait too long before you add that secondary stimulus, the body will go back to baseline homeostasis and that it was at before the initial stimulus occurred. So it's almost like bypassing that first hard effort entirely. You might as well not have done it. So you can see kind of the schematic of that in these graphs here. And what you're aiming for is this right here, where you're progressively getting a positive supercompensation, and this is basically the athlete getting stronger. And then each of these arrows here, those mark the training stimulus, where you're hitting the athlete with a hard effort. And then when it dips down like this is when the athlete has been stressed and they need to come back up and recover. That's this upswing right here, and then they get hit again, and this is why timing is so important. So this is when things get highly individualized for every athlete, and this is where a training plan is going to be very beneficial, especially an individualized training plan, rather than just a generic training plan, like doling out plans to every athlete on your team that's exactly the same isn't really going to work. And it comes down to super compensation, the reason why you can't just hand out generic plans. And that's because every athlete is going to respond differently to the training stress. So you could have one athlete who can recover within 2 days after a hard training session, and at the same time you can have another athlete where it takes them 4 days to recover from the same training session. And so this is why making a training plan and timing is so important. So continuing on off of supercompensation and training stimulus, it's important to talk about the taper. Now, a taper is hugely important in any periodized training program. It's when the body is left unstimulated for a period of time so that the athlete can be adequately primed for race competition. By this time, your athlete has acquired enough of an adaptation to withstand stress that they're ready to compete at the level that they have been training for. This chart here is one from Central Cross Country Ski Association, or CXC, and what they have done is made a specific strategy for a taper that starts 3 weeks before a big race competition. And then you can see in week 1, all of the training is done at very low intensities every day. And then in week 2, it supplements 2 days of higher intensity. And then in week 3, it backs off to having only 1 day of intensity. And then week 4 here, that's your race week. So this is where you're going to have your actual races alternating with days of very low intensity and recovery. So during a taper, it's very important for the athlete to pay very, very close attention to staying healthy and keeping energy reserves as high as possible without losing any base training adaptations. The real goal here is to maintain, and stay healthy. So moving on to what a specific yearly training plan might look like. Here we have a chart that looks at the different months. So we now know that a month can be quantified as a training block or a mesocycle. So within each of these blocks, you can see that there's a certain prescribed number of hours that the athlete should be training at. So, for example, in May here, they should be training 47 hours. In June, they're training 47 as well, actually more like 48 hours. So then it goes down the line. July is 55, August is 42 hours, So at the end of the training year, they should have completed about 370 hours of training. So that would be their yearly volume. More specifically, we have the amount of time that the athlete should be spending in different levels of intensity. For Nordic skiing, we have the typical base intensity levels are based off of VO2 max test or a lactate threshold test. So level 1 is going to be your lowest intensity range. So that's where a lot of your aerobic training is going to be. And then it goes progressively, it gets higher in intensity as you go. Level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4 is about race pace. And that's going to be where you're typically going to be racing. And then level 5 is definitely race pace. And it can be an overspeed situation, and it's highly intense. So anyway, this training plan prescribes the amount of time that should be spent in each of these intensity zones. So if I was the athlete looking at this plan and I saw that I had to train 23 hours in level 1 for the month of May, this means that I'm going to be doing 23 hours of aerobic work, essentially. So this gives the athlete a good idea of what they would be doing and how hard they should be doing it when they're given the opportunity to log what modality they did their training in. So whether it be strength or classic skiing, skate skiing, or other sports like biking. So this would be a good example for a freshman probably, or maybe a sophomore. Someone who is training 370 hours is probably relatively new to having a training plan. So then piggybacking off of yearly hours, when it comes to the end of the training year, it's important to kind of look at how the previous year went. So the reason you have to do that is to help with planning for the next year. Things you need to consider are how your training plan worked in general. Was it too aggressive? Did it leave the athlete overtrained, or was it too modest? Did it leave the athlete with much more reserve after the race season was over? Based off of the answers to those questions, the coach and the athlete can decide then what they want to implement for the next training year. So one thing to note is that if the athlete wants to be racing beyond high school, in college, or on an Olympic development team, they should be able to withstand a yearly training volume of between 500 and 600 hours by their senior year. So now looking at previous knowledge about macro cycles, this is something that as a freshman, or whenever they had decided that they wanted to ski beyond high school, that would be one of their goals, that by the time I am a senior in high school, I want to be training between 500 and 600 hours, and obviously having effective race results at the same time. So then from there, from that overreaching goal, you can take a step backwards, implementing how you're going to get there and planning through micro, meso, and macro cycles, like just exactly how you're going to get there. May 1st typically marks the annual anniversary for a new training year for Nordic skiers across the country, because that typically gives them enough time to recover from the last race of this season, from the last training year. So in conclusion, coaches and athletes should have a periodized plan for Nordic skiing, in order to improve body function, optimize performance, and basically in order to build the best machine possible to use out on the race course. So with that, I hope you learned something valuable about junior and Nordic skiing and about training plans in general. So thanks for listening. Bye.